Why would one of the world's oldest democracies suddenly move to eliminate seats in its parliament that have existed for centuries? In Britain's upper chamber, fewer than 100 aristocrats still held legislative power simply because of birthright. Now that system is being dismantled. What you are about to see is the deeper story behind the decision to remove hereditary peers from the House of Lords and why a centuries-old constitutional arrangement is finally reaching its endpoint. If this reform succeeds, it will reshape how Britain's parliament legitimizes authority in its second chamber. If it fails or stalls, critics argue the United Kingdom could remain tied to a structure that blends democratic lawmaking with inherited privilege. The stakes extend beyond symbolism because the House of Lords reviews legislation affecting everything from national budgets to foreign policy oversight. Changing who sits in that chamber changes how scrutiny works inside one of the world's most influential parliamentary systems. The reform centers on legislation approved by Britain's parliament to remove the remaining hereditary peers from the House of Lords. The measure passed the upper chamber itself, marking the final stage of a long constitutional transition that began in the late 20th century. The bill was introduced by the Labour government, led by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, fulfilling a manifesto commitment to modernize the institution and end the principle that legislative authority could be inherited through aristocratic titles. To understand the significance of the decision, you have to look at the structure of the British Parliament. It operates as a bicameral legislature consisting of the elected House of Commons and the appointed House of Lords. The Commons contains 650 members chosen through national elections. The Lords, by contrast, has roughly 800 members who are largely appointed for life by the monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister, political parties, or an independent appointments commission. Historically, however, the Lords was dominated by hereditary aristocrats. For centuries, Britain's political system allowed noble families to pass legislative seats through inheritance, meaning a duke, earl, or baron could automatically gain a place in Parliament when a predecessor died. By the late 20th century, more than 600 hereditary peers still sat in the chamber, giving aristocratic families a powerful institutional role within national lawmaking. The first major attempt to dismantle that system came in 1999 during the government of Prime Minister Tony Blair. His administration passed legislation removing most hereditary members from the chamber. The reform eliminated more than 600 seats tied to aristocratic lineage. However, negotiations with conservative lawmakers produced a compromise. 92 hereditary peers were allowed to remain temporarily as part of an interim arrangement intended to preserve political balance during a transition period. That temporary compromise lasted far longer than originally expected. For more than 25 years, those 92 hereditary members continued to participate in debates and votes within the House of Lords. Over time, the arrangement increasingly appeared out of step with modern democratic norms, especially as Britain promoted institutional reform abroad while maintaining inherited legislative roles at home. The new legislation approved by Parliament now removes those remaining hereditary seats. Once implemented, individuals will no longer gain legislative authority simply because they inherit an aristocratic title. Instead, membership in the upper chamber will depend on appointment as life peers or on positions reserved for bishops of the Church of England. The government argues that this change represents a first phase in a broader modernization program affecting retirement rules and participation requirements. Current parliamentary data illustrates the unusual scale of the House of Lords. With around 800 members, it is one of the largest legislative chambers in the world, larger than many national parliaments, and even exceeding the membership of Britain's elected House of Commons. Critics argue that such size reflects an appointments process vulnerable to patronage, where political allies and donors can receive life peerages that grant them permanent legislative influence. Despite its size, the House of Lords holds limited formal power compared with the Commons. The chamber can examine bills, propose amendments, and delay legislation for further review. However, it cannot permanently block laws passed by elected representatives. If disagreements persist, the House of Commons ultimately retains the authority to override changes made by the Lords through established parliamentary procedures. Even with those limits, the Lords still shapes legislation. Committees in the chamber often analyze complex policies such as financial regulation, national security frameworks, and international treaties. Former judges, diplomats, military leaders, and academics frequently serve as life peers, giving the chamber a reputation for technical scrutiny rather than partisan competition. Removing hereditary members therefore changes not only the symbolism of the institution, but also the composition of expertise inside it. Consider the first possible scenario. What if this reform leads to a deeper restructuring of the entire upper chamber? Some constitutional scholars have long proposed replacing the appointed lords with a partially elected Senate representing the nations and regions of the United Kingdom. If political momentum builds after the removal of hereditary peers, Britain could move toward a more explicitly democratic second chamber for the first time in its modern constitutional history. Now consider a different possibility. What if the reform stops at removing hereditary members but leaves the broader appointment system unchanged? In that case, the House of Lords would still rely heavily on nominations from political parties and prime ministers. Critics would likely continue arguing that the chamber remains susceptible to patronage and that its size undermines efficiency. The symbolic change might therefore resolve one historical anomaly without addressing deeper institutional debates. The political motivations behind the current reform also matter. The Labour government framed the bill as part of a program to strengthen institutional legitimacy and align parliamentary structures with modern expectations of accountability. By removing the remaining hereditary peers, ministers argue that legislative authority should stem from appointment based on experience or public service rather than inherited privilege linked to aristocratic lineage. What viewers should watch next is whether this moment becomes the beginning of deeper constitutional redesign or simply the conclusion of a reform process that began in 1999. Either way, the decision illustrates how even the oldest political institutions eventually confront the pressure to adapt when legitimacy, representation, and tradition collide within a modern democracy.